The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, crisp autumn air carrying the scent of dying leaves through Jack Miller's cramped downtown apartment. The envelope bore the letterhead of Lawson and Associates, a small law firm from Pine Valley County, a place Jack had never heard of, despite his 23 years practicing law in the state capital. Mr. Miller, the letter began in formal legal language. We regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Theodore Miller, on September 15th, as the sole surviving heir mentioned in his last will and testament. You have inherited his property located at 447 Timber Ridge Road, Pine Valley County. Jack stared at the letter, trying to place this relative in his family tree, Theodore Miller. The name stirred vague childhood memories of holiday gatherings where adults whispered about Uncle Ted, the hermit who lived alone in the mountains and hadn't spoken to the family in decades. Jack's father had mentioned him occasionally, always, with a mixture of exasperation and concern about the old man's reclusiveness. The inheritance couldn't have come at a more perfect time. 3 months earlier, Jack's divorce from Linda had been finalized, a bitter 80-month battle that left him emotionally drained and financially depleted. His law practice, once thriving, had suffered during the lengthy proceedings as he struggled to maintain focus while his personal life crumbled. The partnership at Brennan, Mills and Associates had politely but firmly suggested he take an extended leave of absence to get his head together. 2 weeks later, Jack drove his aging Honda Civic up the winding mountain roads toward Pine Valley County. The landscape transformed from suburban sprawl to rolling hills, then to dense forest punctuated by expansive-looking homes behind iron gates. He followed his GPS through increasingly narrow roads until he reached Timber Ridge Road. It's barely more than a dirt path carved through towering pine trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing. Jack's heart sank at first sight. The structure was more ramshackle than rustic, with a sagging front porch, peeling paint and shingles that had seen better decades. A stone chimney rose crookedly from the roof, and several windows were cracked or boarded over. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and an old truck sat rusting in what might have once been a garden. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. Theodore had apparently been meticulous about maintenance despite the exterior's shabby appearance. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen area, and shelves lined with books on subjects ranging from geology to property law. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom where Jack found more books and boxes of papers. The solitude was exactly what Jack needed. For the first time in months, he felt his shoulders relax as he sat on the porch that first evening, listening to wind whisper through the pines. No traffic noise, no ringing phones, no process servers or opposing counsel demanding his attention. Just silence and the gradual healing it promised. Over the next few days, Jack began exploring the property. The plot seemed larger than he'd expected, extending well beyond what he could see from the cabin. Old survey stakes marked boundaries. That disappeared into thick forest, and several times he found himself walking for an hour before turning back. His great-uncle had apparently owned more land than the modest cabin suggested, while cleaning out Theodore's belongings. Jack discovered boxes filled with documents dating back decades. Land surveys, property deeds, tax records, and correspondence with various county offices and surveyors. Theodore had apparently been obsessed with property boundaries and legal descriptions, spending considerable time and money on surveys and research that seemed excessive for a simple mountain cabin. Most of the documents were too technical for Jack to decipher without careful study, filled with references to township grids, section corners, and survey markers. But several letters caught his attention, particularly correspondence with the county assessor's office questioning property tax calculations and boundary descriptions. Theodore had clearly believed something was wrong with how his property was officially recorded, though his complaints seemed to have been dismissed by bureaucrats who viewed him as an eccentric old man. One evening, while sorting through a particularly dense collection of survey maps, Jack heard vehicles approaching. On the dirt road, headlights swept across the cabin windows as several SUVs pulled into his clearing. He stepped onto the porch to find 5 people in business attire climbing out of expensive vehicles, looking distinctly out of place in the forest setting. Group was led by a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a tailored suit that probably cost more and Jack's monthly rent. She strode forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Mr. Miller, I presume," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Helen Cross, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. We need to talk." Jack shook her hand cautiously. "About what?" "About this." Helen gestured dismissively at the cabin. "This property sits within our community boundaries, and frankly, it's become an embarrassment. Our residents have invested millions of dollars in their homes, and this ... structure is dragging down everyone's property values." The other HOA board members nodded in agreement. A thin man in wire-rimmed glasses introduced himself as Robert Chen, the association's treasurer, while a heavy-set woman named Patricia Wells explained she chaired the Architectural Review Committee. The remaining two members, David Martinez and Eleanor Foster, stood silently but supportively behind Helen. "I wasn't aware this property was part of any homeowners association," Jack replied. "I certainly haven't received any documentation about HOA membership or fees." "That's because your gretuncle refused to participate," Helen said with obvious irritation. "Theodore Miller was a thorn in our side for 15 years, ignoring our community standards and refusing to maintain his property appropriately. Hoped his passing might provide an opportunity for improvement." "What kind of improvement did you have in mind?" Patricia Wells stepped forward with a folder full of photographs and architectural plans. "We've taken the liberty of developing renovation proposals that would bring this property into compliance with our community standards. A complete rebuild would be optimal, but we understand budget constraints might make that challenging." Flipped through the folder, his irritation growing with each page. The proposed renovations would transform his humble inherited cabin into something resembling a luxury ski lodge, complete with stone facades, wraparound decks, and landscaping that would cost more than he'd paid for his law degree. "This is very generous," Jack said carefully, "but I'm not interested in renovating the cabin. I like it the way it is." The temperature of the conversation dropped noticeably. Helen's professional smile became strained. "Mr. Miller, I don't think you understand the situation. This isn't a request. Our community has covenants and standards that every property owner must follow. Your gretuncle may have gotten away with ignoring them, but that ends now." "I'd like to see these covenants," Jack said. "Since I apparently own property in your community, I should have received copies of all governing documents." Robert Chen produced a thick binder from his briefcase. "Here are the current community standards, architectural guidelines, and enforcement procedures. You'll note that significant property modifications require Architectural Review Board approval. Before any work begins," Jack accepted the binder but didn't commit to reading it immediately. "I'll review these documents and get back to you. There's also the matter of back dues," Helen added. "Your great-uncle owed 15 years of HOA fees, plus penalties and interest. The current balance is $28,000. $28,000? Jack's voice rose despite his attempt to stay calm. "For what services? Road maintenance? Common area upkeep? Administrative costs? Legal fees associated with enforcement actions?" David Martinez recited as if reading from a script. "Every property owner contributes to the community's operational expenses. I don't use any common areas, and this dirt road hardly seems maintained. The fact that you choose not to participate doesn't exempt you from your obligations," Helen replied coldly. "We'll expect payment within 30 days, along with a detailed renovation plan for architectural review." After the HOA delegation left, Jack spent hours reading through their community standards. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach, regulating everything from paint colors and mailbox designs to the types of vehicles that could be parked in driveways. Fines for violations started at $500 and escalated quickly for repeat offenses. More troubling were the enforcement mechanisms. The HOA claimed broad authority to conduct property inspections, levy fines, and even place liens against non-compliant properties. They could apparently force the sale of homes that accumulated sufficient violations. With proceeds used to cover outstanding fines and fees, Jack's legal training kicked in as he analyzed the documents. While HOS did have significant power when properly established and administered, their authority wasn't unlimited. Property owners had rights. Associations couldn't simply impose arbitrary rules or retroactive fees without proper legal foundation. The next morning, Jack drove into Pine Valley's town center to research the HOA's legal standing. The county courthouse was a small brick building that also housed the assessor's office and clerk of courts. Jack introduced himself to Martha Henderson, the county clerk, explaining that he'd inherited property and wanted to understand the local OAS's authority. Martha was a woman in her 60s, who'd clearly worked in local government for decades. She knew every property owner, every boundary dispute, and every political feud in the county. "The Pine Valley HOA," she said with a slight frown. "Helen Cross's little kingdom. They've been a source of headaches for this office since they incorporated. 15 years ago? What kind of headaches? Overreaching, mostly. They seem to think they have authority over properties that were never actually part of their development. Your Gretkunkel's place, for instance. Theodore never signed any covenant agreements or paid HOA fees because his property predates their community by 50 years. This was news to Jack. So I'm not actually subject to their rules? Not in my opinion, but I'm not a lawyer. Helen Cross has deep pockets and aggressive attorneys. They've successfully bullied several property owners into compliance over the years, even ones with questionable legal standing." Martha pulled out a large plat map showing property boundaries throughout the area. Jack's inherited parcel appeared as a small rectangle surrounded by the much larger Pine Valley development, like an island in an ocean. "Your Gretunkel's property is what we call a holdout parcel," Martha explained. "When developers assemble land for large projects, there's usually one or two property owners who refuse to sell. The development goes forward around them, but those original properties retain their independent status, unless they voluntarily join the association." Exactly. Theodore Miller definitely never volunteered for anything involving Helen Cross. Armed with this information, Jack felt more confident about resisting the HOA's demands. He spent the rest of the day researching property law and HOA authority, confirming that associations couldn't unilaterally impose membership on unwilling property owners. That evening, he called Helen Cross to inform her that he wouldn't be paying the demanded fees or submitting renovation plans. "Mr. Miller," Helen's voice was ice cold, "I strongly advise you to reconsider. This association has significant resources and experience dealing with non-compliant property owners. Miss Cross, I've done some research. My property was never part of your development, and I never agreed to join your association. If no authority over my cabin or my land. We'll see about that." The line went dead. Over the following weeks, Jack settled into a routine at the cabin. He chopped firewood, read Theodore's extensive book collection, and continued sorting through the boxes of documents his Gretunkel had accumulated. The paperwork was fascinating in its thoroughness. Theodore had apparently spent decades researching every aspect of his property's history and legal status. Among the papers, Jack found correspondence with multiple surveyors dating back to the 1990s. Theodore had hired professional land surveyors at least 6 different times, always questioning the accuracy of previous surveys and demanding more precise measurements. The surveys themselves were highly technical, filled with references to section corners, benchmark monuments, and mathematical calculations that meant little to Jack without proper training. But Theodore's letters to the surveyors revealed his growing conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with how his property had been mapped and recorded. He repeatedly questioned why his tax assessments seemed too low, why his property descriptions didn't match what he observed on the ground, and why county records seemed inconsistent with actual boundary markers he'd found in the field. The surveyors' responses were polite but dismissive. They acknowledged Theodore's concerns but explained that property boundaries were established through complex legal and historical processes that couldn't be easily challenged by individual landowners. County records were presumed accurate unless proven otherwise through expensive legal proceedings that rarely succeeded. One surveyor's letter particularly caught Jack's attention. In 1998, a firm called Precision Land Services had conducted what they described as a comprehensive historical boundary analysis for Theodore. Their report, buried deep in one of the document boxes, ran to over 40 pages of technical findings and conclusions. Jack struggled through the surveyor's technical language. The basic findings were startling. Precision Land Services had discovered what they termed significant discrepancies between the original territorial survey conducted in the 1880s and subsequent county mapping efforts. The original survey had apparently been based on natural landmarks and magnetic compass readings that had shifted over time, creating cumulative errors that grew larger with each subsequent mapping effort. More intriguingly, the report suggested that Theodore's property might actually be much larger than county records indicated. The original territorial survey had described the property using natural boundaries that encompassed a much larger area than the neat rectangular parcels shown on modern maps. Historical research indicates the original patent described property A as extending from Timber Ridge Creek to the high point of Pine Mountain, following natural drainage patterns eastward to the Old Indian Trail, the report stated. Subsequent surveys appear to have arbitrarily reduced this area without proper legal authority, possibly due to mapping convenience rather than actual boundary determination. Jack spread out modern maps alongside the historical surveys, trying to understand what the technical language meant in practical terms. If the Precision Land Services report was accurate, Theodore's property might extend far beyond the small clearing where the cabin sat. The high point of Pine Mountain was several miles from the cabin, and following natural drainage patterns eastward could encompass thousands of acres. But Theodore had apparently never acted on these findings. His letters to attorneys and county officials had been ignored or dismissed. The cost of challenging established property boundaries through the courts was prohibitive for a retired man living on a fixed income. As autumn deepened into winter, Jack found himself drawn deeper into the mystery of his inherited property. He hiked through the forest following old survey markers and boundary descriptions, beginning to see the landscape through Theodore's eyes. What had initially seemed like a small mountain cabin now felt like the center of something much larger and more complex. The Pine Valley HOA, meanwhile, hadn't given up their campaign against Jack's property. Helen Cross and her board members had escalated from personal visits to formal legal demands. Jack received certified letters claiming the cabin violated county building codes, created fire hazards, and posed environmental risks to the surrounding community. The letters were clearly part of a coordinated harassment campaign. Code enforcement officers appeared at the cabin weekly, citing violations ranging from improper septic system maintenance to unlicensed electrical work. Each violation carried substantial fines and deadlines for compliance that seemed designed to be impossible to meet. Jack fought back with his legal training, filing appeals and demanding proper documentation for each alleged violation. Most of the citations were based on community standards rather than actual county codes, and Jack was able to get several dismissed through administrative hearings. But the process was time-consuming and expensive, exactly what the HOA intended. Helen Cross made her strategy clear during one particularly contentious hearing at the county courthouse. As Jack successfully challenged another bogus citation, she approached him in the parking lot afterward. "You can't win, Mr. Miller," she said with a confident smile. "I have resources you can't imagine, and all the time in the world. This community has standards, and your little shack is going to comply with them one way or another. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I've dealt with holdouts before. They always give up eventually." That night, Jack called his former law partner, Mike Brennan, to discuss his situation. Mike listened sympathetically but offered little encouragement. HOAs can be vicious, Mike warned. They have dedicated legal budgets and nothing better to do than harass property owners into submission. Even if you're legally in the right, the cost of fighting them can be ruinous. "So you think I should just give in?" "I think you should consider whether this battle is worth fighting. How attached are you to this cabin, really?" Jack considered the question seriously. A few months earlier, he might have walked away rather than face a lengthy legal fight. But something about Theodore's research and the HOA's bullying tactics had awakened his combative instincts. No, this wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about standing up to people who used money and legal intimidation to get their way. Winter arrived early in Pine Valley County, and Jack found himself snowed in for days at a time. The isolation gave him ample opportunity to study Theodore's documents more carefully. Using a magnifying glass and legal pad, he began creating his own Analysis of the survey discrepancies that had obsessed his great-uncle. The more he studied the historical records, the more convinced he became that Theodore had been onto something significant. The original territorial survey from 1884 had been conducted hastily by overworked government surveyors working across vast areas of frontier land. Their measurements had been based on natural landmarks, compass bearings, and pacing off distances on foot methods that left considerable room for error. Subsequent surveys had attempted to reconcile these original descriptions with more precise, modern techniques, but they seem to have made assumptions about property boundaries rather than conducting thorough historical research. County mapping efforts had prioritized creating neat, orderly property divisions over accurately reflecting the original territorial grants. Jack found himself making lists of discrepancies between different surveys, noting how boundary descriptions had changed over time without apparent legal authority. Theodore had been asking the right questions, but he'd lacked the resources and legal standing to demand answers. As winter deepened, the HOA's harassment campaign intensified. Jack returned from supply runs to town to find code enforcement officers waiting at his cabin, clipboards ready with new violations. His septic system allegedly posed environmental hazards. Guessed his generator created noise pollution. His firewood pile violated fire safety regulations. Each citation required a response within strict deadlines, and the fines accumulated quickly. Jack spent more time defending against bureaucratic harassment than he did researching his property mystery, exactly what Helen Cross intended. The breaking point came in February. During one of the harshest winters in recent Pine Valley County history, Jack had been snowed in for over a week when he heard the distinctive rumble of heavy machinery approaching through the forest. He looked out to see a county truck with a snowplow clearing the dirt road to his cabin, followed by several other official vehicles. The convoy pulled into his clearing and disgorged a small army of county officials, code enforcement officers, and what appeared to be contractors with measuring equipment. Leading the group was Helen Cross, bundled in an expensive fur coat, but wearing a triumphant smile. "Mr. Miller," called Deputy Sheriff Tom Watson, "we have a court order for emergency demolition of this structure. You need to gather your essential belongings and vacate immediately." Jack examined the court documents with growing disbelief. Judge Patricia Coleman had signed an order declaring the cabin an immediate public health hazard requiring emergency demolition to protect the surrounding community. The order cited accumulated code violations, environmental hazards, and fire risks that supposedly couldn't wait for normal legal proceedings. "This is ridiculous," Jack protested. "Half these violations are bogus, and I've been appealing them through proper channels." "That's not my problem," Deputy Watson replied. "I have a court order, and it's getting executed today. You've got 30 minutes to gather whatever you can carry." Jack called his attorney on his cell phone, but the emergency nature of the court order left little room for immediate appeal. Emergency demolitions were designed for situations involving genuine public safety hazards, and judges rarely second-guess such determinations without extensive hearings. As Jack frantically stuffed his belongings into garbage bags and suitcases, he watched the contractors unload their equipment. Helen Cross supervised the operation with obvious satisfaction, occasionally pointing out specific areas of the cabin she wanted demolished first. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" Jack asked her during one of his trips to load his car. "Business," Helen replied coolly. "Nothing personal about protecting community standards. $28,000 in made-up fees and 6 months of harassment says otherwise. You had opportunities to resolve this reasonably. You chose confrontation instead." Within 2 hours, Jack's inherited cabin was reduced to rubble and splinters. The contractors worked with efficient ruthlessness, using bulldozers and excavators to level the structure completely. Theodore's books, the boxes of documents, the simple furniture that had furnished Jack's retreat, everything was destroyed or buried under debris. Jack sat in his Honda Civic at the edge of the clearing. Ching. His temporary refuge disappear. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Helen Cross hadn't just demolished a building. She'd obliterated his attempt to find peace and solitude after his divorce. The cabin had represented a fresh start, and now it was gone. But as he watched the demolition crew finish their work, Jack felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Not despair or defeat, but cold, focused anger. The kind of anger that had made him a successful litigator before his personal life fell apart. Helen Cross had just made a very expensive mistake. That night, Jack checked into the Pine Valley Inn, a modest motel at the edge of town. He spread Theodore's surviving documents across the bed and began making phone calls. The first call was to Mike Brennan, asking for the name of the best land use attorney in the state. The second was to Precision Land Services, the surveying firm that had conducted the comprehensive boundary analysis for Theodore in 1998. Dr. Williams speaking. Answered a gruff voice when Jack reached the surveying firm's president. Dr. Williams, my name is Jack Miller. You conducted a boundary analysis for my great-uncle, Theodore Miller, 1998. I need to know if you still stand behind your findings. There was a pause. Theodore Miller, ... Yes, I remember that project. Fascinating case, actually. We found significant discrepancies in the historical survey record. Why do you ask? Because I just inherited Theodore's property. I think those discrepancies might be more important than anyone realized. Dr. Williams agreed to meet Jack the following day. His office was located in the state capital, a 2-hour drive from Pine Valley County. And Jack arrived early for their appointment. Dr. Williams turned out to be a scholarly man in his 70s, with thick glasses and the precise manner of someone who'd spent decades working with mathematical calculations. Your great-uncle was obsessed with accuracy, Dr. Williams recalled, as he pulled Theodore's file from his archives. Most property owners are satisfied with general boundary approximations, but Theodore demanded to know exactly where his property lines were located. That level of precision led us to discover some very interesting historical discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Errors in the original territorial survey that were never corrected. The 1884 survey was conducted under difficult conditions. By overworked government surveyors, they used natural landmarks and compass bearings to establish property boundaries. But some of their measurements were significantly inaccurate. Dr. Williams spread out copies of historical survey maps alongside modern topographical charts. With a ruler and calculator, he began walking Jack through the technical findings that had fascinated Theodore. The original territorial grant described: your great-uncle's property is extending from Timber Ridge Creek to the high point of Pine Mountain, then following natural drainage patterns eastward to what was called the Old Indian Trail. Dr. Williams explained. The total area described in that original survey was approximately 2,847 acres. Jack stared at the figure. 2,800 acres. The county has my property listed as 12 acres? Exactly. Subsequent surveys arbitrarily reduced the property boundaries without proper legal authority. County mapping efforts in the early 1900s prioritized creating neat, uniform property divisions over accurately reflecting the original territorial grants. But why wasn't this error ever corrected? Several reasons. First, your family apparently never challenged the reduced boundaries, possibly because they were paying lower property taxes on the smaller area. Second, most of the disputed territory was dense forest with no development pressure, so boundary disputes rarely arose. Third, correcting such errors requires expensive legal proceedings that most property owners can't afford. Dr. Williams pulled out a modern aerial photograph of Pine Valley County with the original survey boundaries marked in red ink. Jack's breath caught as he saw the true extent of his inherited property. The original territorial grant encompassed not just the clearing where his cabin had stood, but thousands of acres of forest, several lakes. Most of the Pine Valley development, including Helen Cross's mansion, the community clubhouse, the golf course, and the main access road that connected the exclusive neighborhood to the county highway. These original boundaries are legally valid, Jack asked carefully. What would that mean for the current property owners in Pine Valley? They would be trespassers, Dr. Williams replied matter-of-factly. Their deeds would be based on fraudulent surveys that illegally subdivided your family's property. Of course, proving that in court would require extensive legal proceedings. It's possible? More than possible. The original territorial survey was conducted under federal authority and carries significant legal weight. The burden would be on subsequent surveyors to prove they had proper authority to alter those boundaries, which I doubt they could do. Jack drove back to Pine Valley County in a daze, his mind racing with possibilities. Helen Cross had demolished his cabin to protect her community's property values. But she might have unknowingly destroyed a building that sat on land she didn't legally own. Over the next several weeks, Jack threw himself into researching the legal implications of Dr. Williams's findings. He hired Robert Kim, a prominent land use attorney recommended by Mike Brennan, and together they began building a case to challenge the Pine Valley property boundaries. Robert was initially skeptical of Jack's claims, but his attitude changed dramatically after reviewing Theodore's accumulated research and Dr. Williams's survey analysis. "This is potentially huge," Robert admitted during one of their strategy sessions. "Quiet title actions based on historical survey errors have succeeded before, but I've never seen one involving this much property or this many affected landowners. What are our chances?" Hard to say. The legal principles are sound, but the practical complications are enormous. We're talking about potentially invalidating hundreds of property deeds and challenging ownership of millions of dollars in real estate. Robert recommended hiring additional experts to verify their findings. A historical research firm confirmed that the original 1884 territorial survey had never been legally superseded by subsequent mapping efforts. A second surveying company independently validated Dr. Williams's boundary calculations. A title research specialist documented the chain of ownership from the original territorial grant through Theodore's inheritance to Jack. Each expert's report strengthened their case, but also made clear the magnitude of what they were attempting. If successful, Jack's quiet title action would be one of the largest property boundary corrections in state history. Meanwhile, Helen Cross and the Pine Valley HOA celebrated their victory over the demolished cabin. The HOA newsletter featured a front-page article about successful enforcement action against non-compliant properties that threaten community standards. Helen was quoted extensively about the association's commitment to protecting property values through vigorous enforcement of community covenants. Jack read the newsletter with grim satisfaction. Helen's public statements about the cabin demolition would serve as excellent evidence of the HOA's motivations when their legal troubles began. In May, nearly 3 months after the cabin's destruction, Jack filed his quiet title action in Pine Valley County Superior Court. The lawsuit named every property owner in the Pine Valley development as defendants, seeking legal recognition of Jack's ownership of all property within the boundaries described in the original 1884 territorial survey. The legal documents were delivered to each defendant by certified mail on the same day, creating an immediate panic throughout the exclusive community. Property owners who'd paid millions for their luxury homes suddenly faced the possibility that their deeds might be legally meaningless. Helen Cross was among the first defendants to call Jack's attorney, demanding an immediate meeting to resolve this frivolous lawsuit. "There's nothing frivolous about it," Robert Kim replied calmly. "We have extensive documentation supporting our client's ownership claims, and we're fully prepared to litigate this matter." "This is extortion," Helen accused. "Miller is trying to steal our homes because we demolished his illegal cabin. Mr. Miller is simply asserting his legal property rights based on historical survey records. If you have evidence that our boundary claims are incorrect, I'm sure the court would be interested to see it." The Pine Valley community exploded into chaos as the implications of Jack's lawsuit became clear. Property values plummeted overnight as potential buyers refused to purchase homes with clouded titles. Banks froze mortgage applications and demanded additional title insurance for existing loans. Several homeowners immediately listed their properties for sale. Preferring to cut their losses rather than fight a lengthy legal battle, Helen Cross hired the most expensive law firm in the state capital, Patterson, Hayes and Associates, to defend against Jack's claims. Their legal team immediately filed motions to dismiss the case, arguing that the statute of limitations had expired for challenging such old boundary determinations. But Robert Kim had anticipated this defense. State law provided that property Owners could challenge fraudulent or erroneous surveys within 10 years of discovering the error. It's not from the date the error was made. Since Jack had only inherited the property and gained access to Theodore's research after his great-uncle's death, the statute of limitations had not expired. The judge presiding over the case, Harold Martinez, was a methodical man with 30 years of experience in property law. He scheduled extensive hearings to review the historical evidence and expert testimony from both sides. Dr. Williams testified for Jack, explaining his survey analysis and the discrepancies he'd found in the historical records. The HOA's defense team brought in their own surveyor, who acknowledged the existence of discrepancies, but argued they were minor and didn't justify overturning established property boundaries. The historical research firm testified about the original territorial survey process and the legal authority of federal land grants. Patterson, Hayes, and Associates countered with arguments about adverse possession and the rights of good faith purchasers who'd relied on county records. As the hearings progressed, it became clear that Judge Martinez was taking Jack's claims seriously. The historical evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's legal team struggled to provide convincing explanations for how subsequent surveys had gained authority to alter the original territorial boundaries. The turning point came when Patterson, Hayes, and Associates attempted to argue that Jack's property claims were somehow fraudulent or manufactured. They suggested that Theodore Miller had fabricated evidence or manipulated historical records to create false ownership claims. This accusation backfired spectacularly when Robert Kim introduced evidence of Theodore's decades-long correspondence with county officials, his multiple independent surveys, and his consistent efforts to resolve the boundary discrepancies through proper channels. Rather than fabricating evidence, Theodore had been trying to get someone to pay attention to legitimate concerns for over 20 years. Judge Martinez also seemed unimpressed by the HOA's arguments about protecting innocent homeowners who'd purchased their properties in good faith. During one heated exchange, he noted that good faith purchases didn't override legitimate property rights, especially when the purchasers had constructive notice of potential boundary issues through publicly recorded documents. The original territorial survey has been part of the public record for over a century, Judge Martinez observed. Any competent title search should have identified these discrepancies before properties were purchased or developed. Helen Cross attended every hearing, sitting in the front row with her legal team and occasionally whispering urgent instructions to her attorneys. Jack could see the growing desperation in her face as the proceedings continued, and the strength of his case became apparent. Outside the courthouse, Helen attempted to approach Jack directly on several occasions. "This doesn't have to destroy our entire community," she pleaded during one recess. "Surely we can reach some reasonable settlement." "Should have thought about that before you bulldozed my cabin," Jack replied coldly. "That was just enforcement of legitimate community standards. You're trying to steal hundreds of homes over a property dispute, not trying to steal anything. I'm asserting my legal ownership of property that belongs to me." As the media attention surrounding the case grew as its implications became clear, local newspapers covered the hearings extensively, and several national publications picked up the story as an example of how historical survey errors could create modern legal chaos. Jack found himself portrayed as either a heroic underdog fighting corporate bullying or a vindictive opportunist trying to profit from legal technicalities. Depending on the reporter's perspective, Helen Cross and the Pine Valley HOA were similarly depicted as either defenders of community values or wealthy elitists trying to steal land through bureaucratic manipulation. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either narrative suggested. Jack genuinely believed he was asserting legitimate property rights that had been ignored for too long. Helen and her neighbors had indeed purchased their homes in good faith, but they'd also used legal intimidation to destroy property belonging to someone else. As the legal proceedings dragged into the summer, the Pine Valley community began splitting into factions. Some homeowners supported fighting Jack's claims regardless of cost, while others favored negotiating a settlement before legal fees consumed whatever remained of their property values. A group calling itself the Pine Valley Property Owners Coalition formed to coordinate the defense against Jack's lawsuit. but internal disagreements quickly undermined their effectiveness. Wealthy homeowners like Helen Cross could afford lengthy litigation, while middle-class families faced potential financial ruin from legal fees and clouded property titles. Several properties went into foreclosure as owners defaulted on mortgages. They could no longer refinance due to title problems. The Pine Valley Golf Course closed temporarily when the management company discovered their lease might be invalid if Jack's ownership claims were upheld. By August, the economic pressure on the community was becoming unbearable. Property values had fallen by 60%, and several local businesses that depended on affluent Pine Valley residents were struggling to survive. Judge Martinez scheduled final arguments for September, nearly a year after Jack's cabin had been demolished. Both legal teams had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on expert witnesses, historical research, and technical analysis. Robert Kim's closing argument was methodical and devastating. He walked through the chain of evidence establishing Jack's ownership claims, highlighting how each piece of historical documentation supported their position. The original territorial survey was unambiguous in its boundary descriptions. Subsequent surveys had arbitrarily altered those boundaries without proper legal authority. Theodore Miller had attempted for decades to resolve these discrepancies through official channels. Your Honor, Robert concluded, this case isn't about legal technicalities or historical curiosities. It's about fundamental property rights and whether those rights can be ignored when they become inconvenient for powerful interests. Patterson, Hayes and Associates made their best effort to salvage their client's position, arguing for the rights of good faith purchasers and the practical impossibility of unwinding decades of property development. But their technical arguments couldn't overcome the historical evidence supporting Jack's claims. Judge Martinez took 2 weeks to consider his decision, before issuing a comprehensive ruling that shocked both sides with its scope and clarity. The court found that Jack Miller was indeed the legitimate owner of all property within the boundaries described in the original 1884 territorial survey. The subsequent surveys that had reduced his family's holdings were conducted without proper legal authority and therefore invalid. Current property owners in the Pine Valley development were occupying land they did not legally own. However, Judge Martinez also recognized the practical complications of his ruling and established a framework for resolving the situation, rather than immediately ordering hundreds of families to vacate their homes. He gave all parties 6 months to negotiate buyback agreements that would allow current occupants to purchase their properties from Jack at fair market values. The court appointed a special master to oversee the negotiation process and ensure that any agreements were fair to all parties. Jack would retain ownership of key parcels, including the main access road, several lakefront areas, and the location where his cabin had been demolished. But most residential properties could be purchased by their current occupants. Helen Cross emerged from the courthouse looking 20 years older than when the proceedings had begun. Her legal bills already exceeded $200,000, and she now faced the prospect of paying Jack for property she'd considered her own for 15 years. This isn't over, she told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Appeal this decision and fight it at every level. But privately, Helen was beginning to understand that her war against Jack Miller had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The Pine Valley HOA's aggressive tactics had transformed a simple property dispute into a legal disaster that threatened their entire community. Over the following months, Special Master facilitated negotiations between Jack and individual property owners. Most residents were able to reach buyback agreements, though at prices significantly higher than their current market values due to the legal uncertainties Jack's ownership claims had created. Some wealthy homeowners like Helen Cross refused to negotiate, preferring to continue fighting through appeals and legal challenges. But their position was increasingly untenable as other community members reached settlements and moved on. With their lives, Jack found himself in the unexpected position of being a major landowner with dozens of tenants and complex negotiations to manage. He hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day administration, while focusing on his long-term plans for the land. The irony wasn't lost on him that Helen Cross's attempt to force him into conformity had ultimately given him control over her entire community. the woman who'd demolished his cabin to protect property values had inadvertently handed him ownership of millions of dollars in real estate, but Jack's victory came with responsibilities he hadn't anticipated. Several families genuinely couldn't afford to purchase their homes at fair market prices. Jack found himself reluctant to evict people who'd been caught up in circumstances beyond their control, working with the special master. Jack developed a payment plan system that allowed lower-income residents to purchase their properties over time. He also established conservation easements on large portions of the forested land to prevent future development while maintaining the area's natural character. The Pine Valley Golf Course presented a particular challenge. Facility employed dozens of local workers and served as a community gathering place. But its operating lease was clearly invalid under Jack's ownership claims. Rather than closing the course permanently, Jack negotiated a new lease with the management company that included environmental protections and public access provisions. Helen Cross continued her legal appeals through the state court system, but her position grew weaker with each passing month. The original territorial survey was a matter of historical record, and no appellate court was likely to overturn Judge Martinez's careful analysis of the evidence. More damaging, too, Helen's cause was the revelation during discovery proceedings that the Pine Valley HOA had known about potential boundary issues for years, but had chosen to ignore them. Internal HOA documents showed that several board members had been aware of Theodore Miller's boundary disputes, but had dismissed them as the complaints of an eccentric old man. This knowledge undermined the HOA's claims of good faith reliance on county records and suggested that they had proceeded with development and property sales despite awareness of potential title problems. By the second anniversary of his cabin's demolition, Jack had successfully negotiated buyback agreements with over 80% of Pine Valley property owners. The community was slowly stabilizing under new ownership structures, though property values remained depressed due to the lengthy legal uncertainties. Helen Cross finally agreed to settle her case in December, nearly 2 years after the legal proceedings had begun. Her final agreement required her to pay Jack $400,000 for her mansion and surrounding property, plus an additional $100,000 in damages related to the cabin demolition. The settlement also included a public apology that was published in the Pine Valley Community Newsletter, acknowledging that the HOA had exceeded its legal authority in demolishing Jack's cabin and harassing him with frivolous code enforcement actions. I regret that our attempts to maintain community standards led to actions that violated Mr. Miller's legitimate property rights, Helen's statement read. The Pine Valley HOA should have worked more cooperatively with Mr. Miller to address our concerns about his property. Jack found the apology somewhat hollow given the years of legal warfare that had preceded it, but he appreciated the formal acknowledgement of the HOA's wrongdoing. With most of the legal disputes resolved, Jack turned his attention to long-term planning for his unexpectedly vast property holdings. He retained ownership of approximately 1,000 acres of forest land, 3 small lakes, the main access road, and several strategic parcels throughout the former Pine Valley. Development, rather than maximizing profit from his legal victory. Jack chose to use his ownership position to create a more sustainable and equitable community structure. He worked with environmental groups to establish conservation protections for sensitive habitat areas while allowing reasonable development in appropriate locations. The old Pine Valley HOA was dissolved and replaced with a voluntary community association focused on maintaining shared amenities rather than enforcing architectural conformity. Property owners could participate or not as they chose, but Jack retained veto power over any activities that might damage the area's environmental integrity. Jack has also established a small trust fund using proceeds from property sales to help local families who'd been financially damaged by the legal proceedings. While he hadn't caused the original survey errors that created the boundary disputes, he recognized that his legal victory had imposed real hardships on innocent people caught in the middle. The cabin demolition site became a symbol of Jack's transformation from victim to victor, rather than rebuilding Theodore's modest structure. Jack constructed a larger but environmentally sensitive home that showcased sustainable building techniques and renewable energy systems. The new house included a library dedicated to Theodore's memory, housing his collection of property law texts and survey documents alongside historical materials about the area's development. Jack often thought about how his great-uncle would have reacted to seeing his decades of research finally vindicated in such spectacular fashion. Local newspapers eventually wrote follow-up articles about the Pine Valley case as an example of how historical injustices could have unexpected modern consequences. Property law professors used Jack's case in their classes to illustrate the importance of thorough title research and the dangers of relying on inaccurate county records. But for Jack personally, the most important outcome was the sense of purpose and accomplishment he'd gained through fighting for principles he believed in, the bitter divorce and professional setbacks that had driven him to. Theodore's cabin seemed like ancient history compared to the challenges he'd overcome in asserting his property rights. He'd discovered that standing up to bullies like Helen Cross required not just legal knowledge, but also patience, resources, and an unwavering commitment to principles, even when the costs seemed overwhelming. 3 years after inheriting a rundown cabin he'd never known existed, Jack Miller had become one of the largest private landowners in Pine Valley County. More importantly, he'd used that position to create a more just and sustainable community that balanced individual property rights with collective environmental responsibilities. The irony that Helen Cross's attempt to destroy his property had ultimately given him control over hers wasn't lost on Jack, but he took no pleasure in her defeat. The legal battle had been necessary to establish his rights, but the real work began afterward in building something better from the wreckage of the old system. On quiet evenings, Jack would sit on his new porch reading Theodore's old books and watching the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and crimson. The solitude he'd originally sought in the mountains had evolved into something richer, a sense of belonging to a place he'd helped reshape through his own efforts and principles. The Pine Valley case had taught him that property rights weren't just abstract legal concepts, but fundamental protections for individual dignity and autonomy. When those rights were threatened by people who thought money and political connections gave them authority over others, sometimes the only response was to fight back with every tool the law provided. Jack's victory had been complete, but costly for everyone involved. The legal proceedings had consumed millions of dollars in attorney fees and expert witness costs. Several families had lost their homes or faced financial hardship due to clouded property titles. The Pine Valley community had been fractured by years of litigation and uncertainty, but from that destruction had emerged a new model for community organization that respected both individual rights and collective responsibilities. Property owners now had genuine autonomy over their land use decisions, while participating voluntarily in cooperative efforts to maintain shared amenities and environmental protections. The old Pine Valley HOA's authoritarian approach had been replaced by something more democratic and sustainable. Instead of architectural conformity enforced through fines and legal intimidation, the new community association focused on education, voluntary cooperation, shared stewardship of the area's natural resources. Jack often reflected on how different things might have been if Helen Cross had approached him with cooperation rather than demands when he'd first inherited Theodore's cabin. A reasonable conversation about community concerns might have led to voluntary improvements that satisfied everyone's interests. Instead, her decision to use legal force against someone she perceived as powerless had ultimately cost her everything. She'd tried to protect property values she'd wanted to preserve were permanently damaged by the legal uncertainties her actions had created. The community cohesion she'd claimed to defend was shattered by years of litigation and internal conflicts. Most ironic of all, Jack's new house was far more attractive and environmentally responsible than Theodore's old cabin had ever been. The stated goal of improving the area's appearance had actually been achieved, but through cooperation and voluntary investment rather than coercion and demolition. The lessons of the Pine Valley case extended far beyond property law. Jack's experience demonstrated how seemingly powerless individuals could prevail against wealthy, well-connected opponents when they had right on their side, and the persistence to see legal battles through to their conclusion. But it also showed How much damage could be caused by people who confused legal authority with moral legitimacy? Helen Cross had possessed the financial resources to manipulate local bureaucracy and intimidate individual property owners, but she'd lacked the actual legal authority to enforce her vision of community standards on unwilling participants. The distinction between having power and having the right to exercise it was crucial, and Jack's case provided a dramatic example of what could happen when that distinction was ignored. As Pine Valley County settled into its new equilibrium, Jack found himself frequently consulted by other property owners facing similar disputes with overreaching HOAs or government agencies. His experience had given him valuable insights into the practical aspects of property rights litigation and the importance of thorough historical research in boundary disputes. He'd also learned that winning legal battles was often easier than managing the complex aftermath of victory. Property ownership came with responsibilities that extended beyond individual interests to include impacts on neighbors, the environment, and future generations. Jack's stewardship of his inherited land reflected these broader responsibilities. Rather than maximizing short-term profits from development or timber sales, he'd chosen to preserve the area's natural character while allowing sustainable human activities that enhanced rather than degraded the local ecosystem. The trust fund he'd established for families affected by the legal proceedings was one example of how victory in property disputes could be used to advance broader concepts of justice and community welfare. While Jack had been legally entitled to evict tenants and maximize his financial returns, he'd recognized that doing so would perpetuate the cycle of conflict that had characterized the old Pine Valley community. Instead, he'd used his position of strength to create opportunities for cooperation and mutual benefit. Former opponents like Helen Cross had ultimately been forced to acknowledge his property rights, but they'd also been given reasonable opportunities to purchase their homes and remain in the community if they chose. The transformation of Pine Valley from an authoritarian HOA community to a voluntary association of property owners had taken nearly 4 years to complete, but the results justified the extended effort. Property values had recovered to reasonable levels as title uncertainties were resolved. Environmental quality had improved under Jack's conservation management. Community relations were more cooperative and less contentious than they'd been under Helen Cross's leadership. Most significantly, the precedent established by Jack's case had encouraged other property owners throughout the state to research their own historical boundaries and challenge questionable HOA authority. Several similar lawsuits had been filed in other counties, though none involved property areas as large as Jack's territorial grant. The Pine Valley case had become a landmark in property rights law, demonstrating that even the most established and wealthy communities couldn't ignore legitimate ownership claims indefinitely. Historical injustices had a way of surfacing when least expected, and the costs of correcting them fell most heavily on those who'd benefited from maintaining the status quo. For Jack personally, the experience had been transformative in ways he couldn't have anticipated when he'd first inherited Theodore's modest cabin. What had begun as a retreat from the complexities of modern life had evolved into an education in the fundamental principles that governed relationships between individuals, its communities, and the land itself. He'd discovered that true security came not from avoiding conflicts, but from understanding the legal and moral principles that should guide those conflicts when they arose. Property rights weren't just about excluding others from your land. They were about creating stable foundations for human cooperation and community development. The cabin that Helen Cross had demolished in her attempt to impose conformity on Jack's property had ultimately been replaced by something far more valuable, a demonstration that individual rights could coexist with collective responsibilities when both were grounded in respect for legitimate authority rather than mere power. As Jack looked back on the 5 years since he'd received that first letter from Theodore's attorney, he realized that his great and call's greatest gift hadn't been the land itself, but the example of patient, persistent research in defense of principles that seemed abstract until they were threatened. Theodore had spent decades documenting the historical injustices that had reduced his family's property holdings, not because he expected to profit from that knowledge, but but because he believed truth and accuracy mattered more than convenience or convention. That dedication to principle had ultimately been vindicated in ways Theodore couldn't have imagined, transforming a hermit's obsession with survey boundaries into a legal victory that reshaped an entire community and established precedents that would protect property rights for future generations. The bulldozers that had destroyed Jack's cabin had inadvertently triggered a chain of events that revealed and corrected historical errors that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Helen Cross's attempt to erase evidence of nonconformity had instead brought national attention to the importance of respecting individual property rights even when they conflicted with community preferences. In the end, the Pine Valley case had demonstrated that the most effective way to protect property values was to respect property rights, even when those rights belonged to people whose choices didn't match prevailing community standards. True community strength came from diversity and voluntary cooperation, not from uniformity enforced through legal intimidation. Jack's victory had been complete, but its greatest value lay not in the wealth or land it had provided, but in the principles it had vindicated and the community it had ultimately created. The cabin was gone, but what had grown in its place was far more substantial and enduring than anything Helen Cross had tried to destroy.